Hello, and welcome to our second webinar of the week. This is our third annual charging. This is our third annual charging infrastructure week. On Monday, we got to hear from three wonderful panelists about different ways our audience members could utilize different green financing tools to advance their clean energy projects. Today, we're going to shift. We began the Charging Infrastructure Week 3 years ago as a way to follow along the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Since then, we have seen historic investments in electric vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure. Today, we look at where we've been, where we are, and where we're headed in the United States journey in transportation electrification. Before we begin, let's go over some housekeeping. Our first presenter will speak for about 20-30 minutes. We will then have a free-form discussion between the Electrification Coalition's Executive Director, Ben Prohaska, and Andrew Wishnia, an architect of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. Following their conversation, we will bring back everyone for a Q&A if we have time. Therefore, please put all of your questions into the chat and we'll try to get them if we can. This event is being recorded and will be sent out hopefully tomorrow. This one is always one of my favorite webinars of the year, and one of the reasons that is because our first presenter, Corey Cantor, has absolutely incredible data that he presents. Anyone who likes to marvel at data, well, you've come to the right place. Corey is a senior associate for Bloomberg who will dive into the state of the EV and EV infrastructure market, and I'll pass it over to him.
Brent, way too kind. It's always great to be here with you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Corey Cantor. I am a senior associate at BNEF, the Clean Energy Research Division arm at Bloomberg. And if you could bring up my slides, I'll go through the kind of presentation material I'm showing today. I think before that, let me just point out exactly what BNEF is, in case you've never heard of this division at Bloomberg before. We cover everything around the clean energy transition, ranging from electric vehicles and clean transport to clean power, to buildings and industry, food, agriculture, and nature, and a bunch of other commodities, from oil and gas and coal, all the way to hydrogen. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out after the webinar. We are a subscriber service serving some of the major automakers, policymakers, financial institutions, and more, helping to explain what's going on in the clean energy transition. And so with that, let's get to the actual content for today. I essentially have broken up today's presentation into about 4 key sections. The first is kind of level setting the EV transition and where we are at globally. Then I'll talk about some of our key themes around the US EV market in particular, including around what's happening for the rest of this year. Then we'll switch over to our long-term EV outlook, where we'll share key findings, and then end with a couple of slides on EV charging. This will just be a taste of some of the materials that we offer at BNEF, and hopefully will stimulate a good conversation around electrification. So let's begin. Are US electric vehicles still on the rise? Well, I think it's a matter of perspective in terms of how far you've come. We look at passenger EV sales last year globally, and we see that they reached almost 14 million units. And that's way different than if we were talking about a decade ago, when passenger EVs were barely a blip on the map. Globally, EV sales hit about 1 million units for the first time in 2017, and then doubled 2 years later in 2019 to 2 million units. I started at BNEF in 2019, and a lot of the conversation in 2020 during the global pandemic was this idea of, would EV sales fall dramatically and never take off at all? Of course, as you can see on the data here, that was not the case, and really the beginning of that global story, led by China and Europe. For 2024, we expect passenger EV sales to rise at a slower rate than in years past, around 20%. And through the first 9 months of this year, global passenger EV sales have risen by about 22%. Now, again, China has been leading this EV transition, because if we look at the US, it's only a small part of that story. But the US has seen some milestones as well. Passenger EV sales reached about 1.4 million units last year, and so it too is beginning to change. One thing I'll note at this point in the presentation, which is worth always describing, when I'm using the term passenger EVs, we at BNEF are referring to both battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. This is obviously a point of contention and one that will likely change over time, but for all the slides you're seeing today, usually they're showing BEV plus PHEV. Now, I showed you that US overall sales number. It looks a little bit better if you look at it through this perspective of passenger EV share of sales. You can argue that the US has lived through almost 3 different phases of electric vehicles thus far over the past 20 years. The first, which is encapsulated here between 2011 and 2017, is EVs being almost de minimis amount of new passenger car sales, below 1%. The Model 3 was released in 2018, ushering in a new era for EVs. Though the US market doubled in market share, it pretty much hung around at a stagnant point between 2018 and 2020, all around 2%. And then starting in 2020 is when you began to see that exponential growth. Passenger EV sales going from about 2% all the way to almost 10% in 2023. Now, this year, if we were to extend that line into 2024, you would see EV share of sale increasing, but at a much slower pace than in the past 4 years. We've seen in recent quarters anywhere from about 10.4% to the mid 9%. And again, there's a lot more work to do. I think a key theme here, both globally, and you'll see it again, but also here in the US, is this idea that US states are embracing EV adoption at different speeds. This is EV share of the US passenger vehicle fleet in 2022 by state. And as you can see here, you begin to differentiate between those that are lagging and those that are leading. And it's not just a California story. California at the end of 2022 had about 3.5% EV share of fleet, but places like Washington, Oregon, Nevada, and the West, we're really seeing impressive EV adoption numbers as well. And many of the Northeast states, like New Jersey, where I'm from, maybe less so in New York State, but again, growth nonetheless. Now that's the growth story. But if you were following the news over the past 6 months or more, you may have seen some things that would have alarmed you. Whether it's the fact that Tesla axed its supercharging team, which has had real impacts on the growth of public charging infrastructure, people questioning whether electric vehicle sales could actually decline this year. I think I've already answered the question globally that that won't be the case, but there have been some quarters when we've cut it close here in the US. Then you had automakers like Mercedes-Benz walking back their 2030 100% EV targets. Tesla, in its own vein, scrapping that Model 2 and pivoting towards robotaxi and autonomous vehicles. Local OEMs like GM and Cadillac walking back their own EV commitments. And then if the industry news itself wasn't stressful enough, you had the fact that President Biden put tariffs on Chinese EVs and Chinese battery materials that make it harder for automakers to keep those EV costs down. And automakers have, as a result, hedged on EVs accordingly, thanks to these headwinds. The data on this chart is from a report we published last month, showing the global EV sales targets announced by legacy automakers. So that's not just people here in the US, that's across the globe. And it doesn't include automakers like Tesla. But as you can see from the chart, EV makers or automakers were getting more and more ambitious on their targets for 2030 up until this year, where they've pulled back. Similarly, they had ambitious expectations for 2025, but as the targets have approached, they pulled back those electric vehicle efforts and expectations. It can sometimes feel like an EV coaster. And I'm sure that the next couple of weeks and the next year will continue this trend of positive momentum and also challenges. Speaking of which, what is next for this US EV market based on what we know? Well, moving forward, there are some real challenges. These are kind of theses that we laid out at the beginning of the year. Public policy remaining uncertain with this election 2 months away, really now 2 weeks away at this point. Public charging remaining a deterrent for owning an EV, which is why many of you here are on this webinar and working in EV infrastructure. Consumer preferences towards larger and more costly vehicles remains a real challenge. And automakers, as I've just shown you, are hedging those EV strategies. And so we put these out back in February, and I think throughout the year have held out really well. That's why consumers are maybe feeling a bit concerned about the switch to electrification. On that point, in every survey that you find, you see the top 2 specific topics come up again and again. Electric vehicles are too expensive, and there's a lack of charging infrastructure stations. Now, this is from a Cox Automotive study put out last year, but you can look at many different studies and find that consumers want more affordable EVs and more charging infrastructure. So I want you guys to keep that in mind as I show you some more slides, because not a lot of progress has necessarily been made if you're not Tesla, for example, or Tesla-enabled charging. Those non-Tesla BEV prices really haven't declined since the start of 2023. So this is data from Edmunds showing the average US transaction price by drivetrain. As you can see, BEVs and PHEVs remain a lot more expensive, closer to $60,000. Uh, Hybrids, which have been having a bit of a boom this year, are closer to $40,000 and your average vehicle around $47,000. This is the point that consumers are not being irrational when they're holding back on shifting towards electric vehicles, particularly on the upfront price range if you're not a Tesla fan. This excludes Tesla, Rivian, and Lucid, but includes many of the other automakers like GM and Ford. By the way, one quick point on plug-in hybrids. They remain expensive due to having multiple drivetrains, so you don't see a kind of pricing premium here. And according to similar data from Edmunds, you really haven't seen PHEVs have the kind of boon that you would expect based on a lot of those news headlines. PHEV sales in general remain really limited here in the US market. Now, on the point of automaker hedging, you might say, why exactly have they done that? Well, US domestic automakers have struggled to achieve near-term goals. This is a chart showing the first half of sales this year from GM and production versus their 2024 production target and their 2025 scrapped production target of 1 million. Now, GM has had actually a very, very good year on electrification after some years of stagnation and difficulties with the Ultium platform scale-up. The Equinox was one of the leading EVs in the last quarter, and the Equinox, Blazer, and Lyriq have all done well. That being said, going from 200,000 units to 1 million units may have been a bridge too far, given the kind of environment that we're in. We do expect them to hit that 200,000 North American production target, but it's something to keep an eye on as we head into this last quarter. Now, Ford made a decision last month to push back a lot of their EV models and platform to 2027, and that decision could reverberate through the North American EV market. On the one hand, it provides an opportunity for automakers like Hyundai and GM to really step into the void. On the other hand, the Mustang Mach-E, up until last quarter, was amongst the top 3 highest selling battery electric vehicles, the first after the Model 3 and Model Y. Now, the Cybertruck has that distinction, but it's a point that Ford made a really attractive model with the Mustang Mach-E and with the Lightning, but those are the only 2 models that they'll be having coming online in the US, at least, based on current plans until 2027. They're still moving forward with some of those commercial EV plans, but it shows how automakers are kind of shifting their horizons back by potentially a couple of years. And it's not just Ford. Tesla has seen production slowing on EVs globally. Now, Tesla has a third quarter that just came out, and their production actually went up slightly year on year, but still nothing like the kind of growth in overall production on years past. Furthermore, Tesla has also been relying on the same exact model lineup since about really 2020, with the exception of the introduction of the Cybertruck, where there are questions that remain around how mass market is going to be. So between these automakers, some of the largest here in the US, there remain many open questions about what the next year could look like. And that's before we even get into policy and politics. Speaking of politics, we did find in the report we published last year a mild relationship between EVs and a state's political culture. There was about a 0.54 correlation between Biden vote share and the share of the electric vehicle fleet in 2022. It doesn't mean that this can't be overcome. It doesn't mean that it can't be solved, because as I noted earlier, even California was only at about 3.5% EV share of fleet. So there's a lot of room to grow on fertile ground. And there were outlier states in Republican land, including Florida and Utah, that saw pretty high EV adoption compared to its peers. But it is important to keep in mind that you're going to have to reach out to people who may not be as easy to convince over to electrification, and work will need to occur there if everyone is eventually to go electric. On the other hand, you may end up with a 70–80% EV share of sale in a couple decades, and that might just be where the market ends up. I mentioned before that charging is a challenge, and this is part of the reason why. NEVI funding remains far too low in terms of share of total sites awarded. According to our data, you're seeing very slow actual award of both CFI and NEVI funding, with days ticking down in the administration for this particular term. And so awarding is just a part of the process. That's before you're interconnecting and going through all of the different steps. So it's no surprise you haven't seen consumers shifting towards EVs on a more quicker basis. But China is moving far faster. So this is data from BNEF showing public charging installations in 2023, 2022, and 2021 by region. And you could see that China really is outpacing the US on a pretty, I'd say, gigantic level. In 2022, US put in 41,000 public charging connectors, which was the exact same as the country of Netherlands in that same year. And then On net, US public EV charging installations actually fell in 2023. So there's a lot of work to do, according to our team over on the charging side. Now, before I move on to our EV outlook, I just want to show some cases for optimism. We do have new EV models and high-quality models recently released. The Volvo EX30, due to those tariffs, was actually delayed, but you do have things like the EX30 coming next year, the Kia EV3, and the Equinox, as well as that Kia EV9. The flip side of not much charging money being spent is that more charging money is coming. You have EV-only automakers like Rivian and Tesla eventually going mass market, even if it's pushed back a year or two. And you do have those Inflation Reduction Act investments beginning to mature, which could have a major impact on what the US EV market looks like in the future, assuming those policies go into place. And I think that's important about assuming that those policies go into place, because I'm about to show you some of our near-term and long-term forecasts from our electric vehicle outlook, which is published every June. This is the cover page from that EV outlook. We do a lot of this work in the spring every year. So that's in March and April of 2024 in this case. So the election, things like Ford's decision to push back won't be shown in the slides ahead, but will have an impact on what the EV kind of near term looks like in the US moving forward. So with that, some of the key findings, which you can also find at our BNEF Electric Vehicle Outlook website. So I encourage you to Google it after this presentation if you would like to learn more. First is this idea, just as I showed you with states, that EV sales growth is slowing in some markets, but still robust in others. So this is the year-on-year change in selective countries in the first quarter of 2024. US and Spain didn't look so hot, and I will report that the US did a lot better in the next subsequent quarters. But look at China and India in particular, nearly 40% year-on-year growth. And as you all know, with China, it wasn't starting from a particularly low place. While we're optimistic moving forward is because this lithium-ion battery prices continue to fall. We do a battery price survey, actually undergone just about now every single year that we release in November or December of each year. And so in 2023, we found that the global average price of a battery was $139 per kilowatt hour, and this was down from about $161 per kilowatt hour the previous year. We expect battery prices to continue to fall, and that's why we see EV adoption continuing to grow. But of course, it doesn't happen as robustly every single year. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example, sent battery prices spiking for the first time from 2021 to 2022. So you never know what the future holds, but we're optimistic that there's continued chemistry shifting and economies of scale building out that should lower this on a global level. Speaking of growth, this is our near-term forecast. So we expect in 2024 globally about 16.6 million passenger EV sales to be sold, rising to about 30.2 million passenger EVs by 2027. Now, we essentially expect China to continue to be that leading region. So China is going to grow from about you're seeing mid 40% up to about 60% by 2027. And we've actually seen in some months this year, China's passenger EV market at over 50% EV share of sale. In second place, we have Europe, which is going to be about 41%. And then, and this is probably the part in an election season that's more controversial, you have US and Canada approaching 28, 29%. And so that's again under current policy with the Inflation Reduction Act, these fuel economy standards, and more. Another big macro picture is this idea that combustion vehicle sales peaked in 2017. This is one that I think when we originally put it out was seen as pretty controversial, but it's held up rather true. If you're looking at pure internal combustion engine vehicle sales, they're now about 30% lower in 2024 based on our expectations. You add hybrids maybe a few years later. But I think the point I like to make to automakers is that whether you're talking battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid, or even conventional hybrids, they're all going to be playing a part of this story, but we're never going back to pure ICE vehicles again. So electric vehicles and batteries will be a part of this global mobility story moving forward. By the end of this year, we expect that there'll be almost 60 million electric vehicles on the road, or about 4% of that global fleet. And again, you've got China, you've got Europe, and the US as the leading markets, but other places like Japan, South Korea could start growing and coming into their own soon. And that long-term outlook is still bright. So by 2040, we expect that there's going to be about 73 million passenger EVs sold every year. And China and Europe will still be the leading markets, approaching 90%. US and Canada around 80%, and that global average over 70%. This is under our base case, known as the economic transition scenario. But of course, if we're going to reach a net zero capable fleet by 2050, sales will have to grow even faster. Now, as a part of these kind of global productions, we do have US passenger vehicles that are set to take off. You look at California, and that's almost a Norway-like exponential growth over the next couple decades. And I think that's something that you'll continue to see occur, regardless of what happens in this election. The question is really what goes on with the rest of the US. How quickly does it approach California? Again, we have California, if it was its own country, as one of the leading electric vehicle places in the world. But even there, they've seen a bit of a slowdown in 2024, really holding around 1 in 4 vehicles sold as electric, which again, if US was at 25% EV share of sale, that would be pretty good, but we set our sights and expectations higher for California. Now, as I just noted, the long-term outlook is still bright, and we expect basically plug-in hybrids and hybrids to remain a major part of the story in our base case, even to 2040, but it's really those pure ICE vehicles that are being squeezed out. Again, what this may look like. Do PHEVs do better? Do they do worse? It's going to depend on each region. But no matter how you slice, electric vehicles are going to be the vast majority of new sales in 2040. Still, fleet turnover takes time. I think we've heard a lot of misinformation on everything going electric tomorrow. But even note in our base case that only around 50% of the fleet will be BEVs and PHEVs, meaning that gas is going to be still used in some form in our base case for quite some time. This has implications on everything from emissions to oil markets. So it's important, if you want to actually lower emissions even quicker, to be really incentivizing those fully electric vehicles, even starting today. We expect in most regions that a car could last on the road between 11 to 17 years. So the more BEVs you sell now, the less you have to sell later. Speaking of that point, we expect that ICE vehicle sales would need to be phased out by the mid-2030s to reach net zero. So really about 2037, 2038 in some of the lagging markets. Otherwise, you're going to be seeing that delta in between the net zero scenario and economic transition scenario, where a lot more emissions will be put onto the roads. Now, some segments are closer to reaching that kind of net zero scenario than others. I won't take too much time talking about it, but we've got 2- and 3-wheelers and buses that are far closer, driven largely due to APAC performance. Cars and light commercial vehicles are on a positive trajectory. And I think from a policymaker perspective, getting those economies of scale around medium and heavy commercial vehicles, or frankly, considering other options like hydrogen and zero emission sources could be on the table, but they're not on track to reach a net zero capable future. And that does include on the medium and heavy side, fuel cell vehicles. This slowing sales growth could put climate targets at risk. So on the right-hand side, you see the net avoided emissions by the transition to EVs and fuel cell. It's going to stop a lot of bad things from happening potentially in terms of further emissions. On the other hand, as you can see on the chart on the right, you're still producing about 4 gigatons of CO2 in 2050 under our base case. So you're going to really have to speed up that transition even faster. Again, road transport emissions are expected to peak in 2028, but if you want to reach net zero, you do need that faster progress starting in the 2030s, but really picking up speed in the 2040s. 2 last slides on this, and I'll do a few on charging and we'll call it a day. Electric vehicles made today are clean, but by 2030, they'll be even cleaner. This is from a life cycle analysis report we put out early this year, and a pretty common misconception in a lot of, I think, a lot of publications. Basically, the day that you buy an EV, as long as your grid is getting cleaner, is going to be the dirtiest day that electric vehicle is charging. But over time, as you can see on the chart, both on a life cycle basis and a use phase basis, electric vehicles are far cleaner than their internal combustion engine counterparts. Most of that emissions use is going to be in manufacturing. So as long as we're cleaning up the grid, we're in really good shape here, particularly in the US, where break-even time between a new EV and a new ICE vehicle is about 2 years and is expected to drop by 1 year. In places like China, you need to do a lot more work and a lot more driving for it to be worth it. But by cleaning up grids in each region, you can kind of make electric vehicles a much cleaner experience. And then finally, one of the thematic highlights from our new report, and I cut the rest due to time, but I encourage you to take a look at our website. There's a conception that EVs are driven a lot less than ICE vehicles, but according to our mobility team, Intelligent Mobility Team. In many regions, BEVs and PHEVs are actually driven more than comparable ICE vehicles. The one exception is here in the US, which was about 40% less on the BEV side and 5% less on PHEVs. But this chart shows it doesn't have to be that way. California saw greater BEV mileage usage, and PHEVs, and Canada did as well for similar region and similar sized locations. So good food for thought that just the way that EV drivers are acting today doesn't necessarily mean they'll act that way in the future. And I'd argue a lot of that is probably charging anxiety, which is why many of us are so interested in where charging infrastructure is moving today and why it's important to continue having conversations around the topic. Speaking of EV charging, I want to just do a few slides on this. The good news is global public charging installations are on the rise. So in 2023, globally, we expected about 1.2 million public charging connector installations. Again, a lot of that's being done in China. Really, you can't even see the US too much until 2024. We expect that to rise to about 1.6 million public charging connectors, but China and Europe, again, are lapping the US. We are finding that electricity demand is rising at public charging stations. So the chart on the left and the one I'm about to show you are EU and US operators. And you can see that basically in pretty much every single case, more and more people are using public charging. Again, folks like Tesla are looking really good. EVgo is seeing some really impressive growth at the end of 2023, and we expect that would continue into 2024. But it all pales in comparison to China, where Tesla globally would be probably the 5th largest operator in China after many of the kind of local folks like T-Good and StarChange. And so on the whole, you just see if you get more electric vehicles in the fleet deployed, they're going to need to charge somewhere. And a lot of them are using public charging as an option. Now, you don't only need to be ready for electric vehicles as they are, but you need to be ready for electric vehicles as they're going to be. So it's not just building out charging, but also building out charging that is ultra fast and can adapt to EVs that need faster charging, like your new class, like your Hyundai Ioniq 5 and 6. And so the US is in decent shape there, but if you look at Germany and France in particular, a larger share is ready for 700 to 1,000 volt vehicles in terms of their charger usage. So again, a lot of work to do, but a lot of reasons to be optimistic too. So with that, I'll just end and say at BNEF, we cover a lot of other different reports. If any of this interests you and you are our subscriber, go to bnef.com. But we cover everything from commercial vehicles and EV charging more in depth to our forecasts that we kind of update on a quarterly basis for a year ahead. And of course, our EV outlook comes out every June. Thanks to Brent and everyone for letting me speak for a bit. And hopefully, this showed why charging infrastructure here in the US is so sorely needed. And thanks to all that you guys are doing on that front.
All right, Corey, thank you so much. Again, as I prefaced, there was a lot of data, and I really appreciate looking at it from not only a national perspective, but seeing what everyone else is doing around the world. So now we're going to switch it up a bit, and rather than a presentation, we're going to have an informal discussion. I'm incredibly humbled to have our next two presenters. So for the next half hour, the EC's Electrification Coalition's Executive Director, Ben Prohaska, and Andrew Wishnia, partner at Epic Works Advisors and a board member of the Electrification Coalition as well, will be discussing the landmark investments in EV and EV infrastructure in the United States. So I'll hand it over to Ben and Andrew for their conversation.
Great. Well, thanks, Brant, and really interesting data that you've provided, Corey. I think there's a few things that as we get into the discussion, that I want to help think about. And so I'm gonna offer some early stage thematics, right? I think one is we're in the early stages of this transition, and it's important to recognize that we've moved very quickly. The technology's gotten better, the charging infrastructure has gotten better. We're seeing rapid deployment on a whole set of things, and even though there's some things that can cause questions about what's the timing look like, I think everyone agrees the future is absolutely electric, and it's just a question of when. But a few things to sort of add to this. We exist because of the economic and national security impacts of oil dependency. And oil has had a monopoly on our transportation sector for far too long, and that has put us at great economic and national security risk. It obviously also has a huge impact on some of the other things that Corey was mentioning, where some may care about climate, some may care about public health impacts, But I would argue one of the things that really is critical here is this is something that really should be and needs to be a nonpartisan issue. We have an opportunity to make sure that the U.S. maintains its automotive leadership. And we, as this transition happens globally, and we heard some other discussion, I think the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law are doing and will do, in addition to many other incentives and regulatory policies, is ensure the U.S. can catch up quickly. So I think sometimes we might look at this and go, there's been a bit of a slowdown in some aspects, but the reality is what we've really done is we've gone a little slower to ensure that we can go a lot faster, and not only faster, but that we can do it sustainably, that we are doing it from a friendshoring and reshoring perspective. So we're really making sure that the U.S. automotive sector is a big part of that leadership, but we're also doing it in partnership with our allies. And we're thinking about all of the right ways to do this in this massive country where we have a very complex automotive sector, a complex consumer market. And I think, unfortunately, there's been a little too much vitriol happening because of the elections, where it's made EVs, to put EVs in the crosshair. And I think that's a mistake. The reality is EVs and electrification should be something that should be, and I'm going to be a little bit corny here, but shouldn't be a red or a blue issue. It should be a red, white, and blue issue. So very excited to have Andrew join us. We passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, almost coming up on our 3-year anniversary. And then followed that up briefly with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is now just past 2 years. And so I guess, Andrew, maybe as a starting point, you come to this having been at the DOT, and so being able to see how this has sort of been deployed, and then now, working with partners across the country and being a part of our board. But, what are some of the barriers that you think have existed to really deploying those funds and accelerating transportation electrification in the U.S.?
Yeah, Ben, thanks so much for having me. Thanks to Safe and Electrification Coalition for having me. It's a real honor to be here and join this conversation. Look, I think to build off of your opening remarks, I think that's exactly the right way to think about it. The interstate system wasn't built in a day or a month or a year or even a decade. It took many decades to build out the interstate system, and it'll similarly take a while to build out an EV charging network, let alone the spine of an EV charging network. We're just upon 3 years now into this journey. And like you said, Ben, we had a lot of foundational mechanisms that securitized investments and ensured a convenient, accessible, reliable, and equitable charging infrastructure network. And as a result, we now have minimum standards. So folks aren't just deploying charging infrastructure for the sake of deploying charging infrastructure. And then to your point about friendshoring and onshoring investments, we have a layer of requirements across the federal aid program, and particularly for EV charging infrastructure, to build and buy America. And so that does two things. It drives adoption and it ensures US competitiveness. The president is absolutely committed to ensure that chargers are made in America and that we have a made in America EV charging network. So all chargers must be Buy America compliant, consistent with the bipartisan infrastructure law, which has provoked new battery manufacturing plants across the country and revitalized cities and regions that were previously hollowed out. Of course, there are challenges, but I think your starting notion that zooming out, we are where we thought we would be, and we're making extraordinary progress thanks to these investments is a point worth honing in on. Look, looking forward, at the same time, we shouldn't be Pollyannish about challenges. I think that there are some really serious challenges with getting dollars out the door as quickly as possible. I think that there are procurement challenges at a state and local level. There are things that we did at a federal level that states and locals will want to use as best practices, particularly in the procurement realm, to make sure that we're being as efficient and effective with deploying dollars as possible. We talked to a lot of CEOs at EpicWorks about the fact that, but for the pace of these dollars, they would be applying for more opportunities. So it's certainly the case that we need to hasten delivery, which includes getting grant agreements done sooner, but everyone's working on that and working a million times a minute. And we just have to figure out sort of what to prioritize and deprioritize, because not everything can be a priority, and we have folks in the federal government that are doing everything possible to make sure that these investments are realized.
You mentioned zooming out, and I think, I appreciate Corey's detail and data, but I think sometimes when we look at just the numbers, we sometimes fail to think through, the idea that we are sometimes competing with authoritarian regimes that have an ability to establish policy mechanisms that can make things move much more quickly. And so sometimes it's really important to look at those. In other cases, it might be that, some countries have been more aggressive on their policy mechanisms. I think what we now see is we are seeing a lot more buy-in. We're seeing both local, state, and federal policy that gets to work in concert. And even this isn't just a function of government largesse, but it's actually the idea that this has been a really important, these two policies, these generational level investments are unlocking that private sector engagement in a way that really is unprecedented in the automotive sector and really the electric sector. And just to give some examples of how to think about this in context, the auto industry in the US represents roughly $1 trillion of revenue on an annual basis, right? It employs somewhere near 5 million people on an annual basis. And these are numbers that ultimately we have to ensure we preserve and protect as we go through this transition. And so I think that when you talked about the work that's happening on the ground and the opportunities and investments from Ira and Bill, I used to like to refer to them as Uncle Bill and Ira, that they are really bringing this all into a sharp focus. And they're saying, okay, now we need to start moving quickly and step into action. And I think it's also showing up in a nonpartisan way. We had Lindsey Graham on the stage last year, Senator Lindsey Graham, who on stage at our SAFE conference, which we're having another one in April this coming year, but he basically had said the same thing we're saying, which is the future is electric. It's just a question of when. So if we sort of looked back at the expediency of or the rollout of the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, what's your sense? Are there things that we didn't get right, or is it something where we really need to be sort of resetting the expectations about what should have happened in the timing?
Well, I think we're exactly where we thought we would be when we signed the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is there's a tension with making sure that charging infrastructure is place-based and that it needs something beyond just deploying charging infrastructure. So for it to be equitable, we have to make sure that it serves overburdened and underserved communities, to make sure that the charging infrastructure is convenient. We have to ensure that uptime is at least greater than 97%, so that folks have a user-centric experience when they're using our national highway system, just like they do for combustion-fueled vehicles today. So I think that there's two worlds in which we could have lived in. One world would have been fewer rules and requirements, and potentially a faster deployment as a result. And this is the other world, and I would prefer this world every time. That's not to say that I'm not concerned again about ways that we can be more efficient and effective. But I think we knew that going in. I can guarantee you that the federal family is doing everything that they can to expedite processes without undermining things like environmental protections. But I think that we have a choice architecture at this point that is consistent with where we started. We have principles of federalism. Ben, you were remarking about sort of how our system compares to the international system. We did place these programs in the Federal Aid Highway Program, which really espouses principles of federalism. So it's state administered and federally assisted, meaning states are the ones that drive these processes, and it's the federal government that provides the rules of the road. I think going forward, we are going to want to look at what more we can be doing to help states and localities on their procurement processes. It makes no sense for these processes to take years. And in some cases, that won't be the case going forward because there are a lot of communities that are doing this de novo. But the more that we can provide best practices and tools, both in terms of their state and local laws, and also in terms of sort of the soft power of technical assistance, I think that augurs well for folks across the country. Maybe the last point here is that a lot of people are coming at this from a state of first impression for a whole collection of reasons. Maybe a state hasn't deployed EV charging infrastructure before. Maybe previously states had deployed the EV charging infrastructure, but they had never furnished the kind of public-private partnerships that were envisioned in the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so there has to be enabling legislation there. So I do think that there is a mix of grace and concentration that's needed to maximize implementation, so we get these dollars out the door as quickly as possible.
You brought up the idea of procurement, which we probably have a broad audience, but one of the things that takes place here, and also this sort of idea that it's going out to state actors, or in the case of CFI, which is the Charging Fueling Infrastructure Program, it's a competitive grant process. There's all kinds of jurisdictions that can take responsibility for deploying the charging that's going to come through that. And we often focus very heavily on light duty, right? So light duty vehicles, passenger vehicles, but the reality is these programs really were designed to focus on the charging infrastructure and the sort of acceleration to the manufacturing sector to affect all sectors. So it's cars, trucks, buses, all of the above, with the idea that ultimately, we basically use about 376 million gallons of gasoline on a daily basis in the US. And so all of those provide those opportunities to start to chip away. And largely people are saying we've already hit peak oil demand, but the procurement side, we do need to move faster. And that is an interesting challenge, and it's a stress to all of these sectors. We've created a couple things for folks that might be on here. One is we created an aggregated purchasing program called the EV Purchasing Collaborative. We did it initially with climate mayors, but the idea is it creates a master contracting authority. So in some instances, if you're a state or you're a city and you've been bogged down in the technical details of how to do your procurement, how to buy this stuff, really that's what procurement is, right? How do you get it using federal funds and other matching funds that might exist? And so I'd encourage people to look that up. It's evfleets.org. But it's a great way that you can sort of get rid of the soft costs of acquisition, right? You can get rid of all those necessary things around the RFP process because it meets all those public requirements around public sourcing and competitive contracting. But when you look at the sort of differences of NEVI versus CFI, right? What's your view on sort of, and just to help everyone who's maybe, watching at home, if you will, what's the important difference between those programs? How should different agencies think about their engagement in making sure these programs meet the goal we all have, which is to accelerate transportation electrification?
Yeah, Ben, first, I think your comment about aggregated purchasing and the work of the Electrification Coalition toward that end is enormously helpful. It's something that the Obama administration executed on in the nation's first sustainability order, which had the most aggressive electrification targets at the time of any country in the world. And a facet of that executive order was for the GSA to look at aggregated purchasing across communities. And I think that was one of the starter kits to get us on the course to where we're at. So I think that makes a ton of sense as a tool in the toolbox. Going forward, I think that, just to hone in on one particular issue, I do think that, there's a sub-recipient allowance, particularly in the CFI program. I think we need to be doing everything possible to ensure that we're matchmaking EVSPs to public entities so that they don't have to go through this exhaustive procurement process going forward. Now, sometimes
Andrew,
it's the key.
Andrew, what's an EVSP, just to make sure that people who maybe don't know that term? know
A
what that
charging
is.
provider. Yeah, an electric vehicle service provider. So yeah, any charging infrastructure provider under a sub-recipient relationship where essentially you've manifested a contract before a larger procurement, it's actually allowable under the CFI program. And so I think we want to be encouraging more of that, which means we need to be getting into localities to educate them about the federal rules and how the federal government's leading by example. And in certain cases, provoke action from those municipalities to do the same. In terms of the differences between CFI and NEVI, yeah, I would say that that's a huge area I think to solve for in the CFI space, is to encourage more sub-recipient partnerships. In NEVI, I think it's going to be a chameleonic program as we initially designed, which means it's not going to be the same program that it is next month or even a year from now. Once states are fully built out, and Rhode Island, as folks that are listening in know, is already fully built out, and we'll hopefully have a couple more states next year. And then going forward, we'll probably have somewhere around 60 to 65% of NEVI funds still available to deploy charging infrastructure anywhere in the state. So one thing I would encourage folks to think about is, I've heard a lot of people talk about the fact that NEVI might not be for them today, which makes sense, but make sure that you're considering NEVI going forward, recognizing that a lot of the rules for the road that were enshrined provide more flexibility the longer time that we have with NEVI, and so should be helpful for more charging infrastructure providers and more communities as we progress down the road, whereas CFI is readily available today for as many communities as possible. Like you mentioned, Ben, not just for light duty vehicles, but also a prioritization for medium and heavy duty vehicles, and public charging across the board, including in and around port facilities, airport facilities, and so on.
And so, I would contend one of the things around this is that we're going to accelerate the learning process across the country, right? So like, we've got a lot of these institutions who maybe haven't deployed infrastructure, haven't been involved in thinking about what does a new transportation future look like, where the energy or the electricity sector and the transportation sector are colliding, right? The cool thing is there's huge benefits that some of these communities are already unlocking, right? So like, electricity is pretty price stable. Oil has huge peaks and valleys. And so even if you're a state government or you're a city government, the opportunity to think about your fleet and go, hey, I can peg my costs to a much more consistent cost of operation is actually incredibly valuable. And I think some places are just now starting to see that, and also seeing huge savings, right? The other part is there's all kinds of other stuff that's happening, the benefits that exist for employees. They like the vehicles better, they're faster, they're quieter, right? So there's even like some unintended benefits that are happening where it's like, people who drive heavier trucks that are really loud, obviously can be very polluting. They're seeing, better responses to things that would be OSHA impacts, right? So occupational health standards that might impact employees. And so it's like, not to try and suggest that somehow EVs are a panacea solution to all the world's problems, but they do actually affect a lot more than sometimes we initially think about. Although at the end of the day, if you're a consumer or you're a fleet, I think the most important thing is these things do exactly what any other car does or any other truck does. They just do it better, cheaper, powered by domestic resources. And that's a really important part of this. And then has the chance and potential to really make sure that we are oil free in our transportation future. And so that's a really, really important thing. It also means we have opposition. So when we think about like sort of, we're in this current dynamic, we're 3 weeks from election day, what do you think are some of the things that have taken place, and why do you think EVs have become such a sort of political challenge right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you put a thumb on the scale of one technology versus another, that's going to cause animus for folks that don't have that same level of support. And I think In this instance, the thumb on the scale was truly performance based for zero emission fuels. So I think the results, like you're aware, are not just in democratic states, but are by and large in so-called red states as well, including Kentucky, South Carolina, Georgia, across the Rust Belt. One story I would not have told during the formation of the bipartisan infrastructure law that I think I have a little more latitude in talking about now is the state of Alabama was one of the most supportive states in terms of supporting our vision of getting this bipartisan infrastructure law done with funding for EV charging infrastructure. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's huge manufacturing facilities in the state of Alabama. So to your point, people come at this from a variety of different perspectives. And part of this is I think we just have to meet people where they are. Whether it's for tourism, economic benefits, and of course for climate benefits, like you said, it's a win-win-win.
I might even make the argument that while climate is a big reason and rationale that a lot of people have pursued transportation electrification, it's in some ways has done a disservice to the other value benefits, and that it kind of that's a political issue sometimes. And while it's becoming less and less one, I would say. The reality is, we are building jobs and sustainable jobs in record numbers in some of those states that are red and purple. And that's where we're seeing huge benefit and huge growth. And I think we're going to continue to see that. And that's a really important sort of step forward is creating these sustainable jobs so that we not only are driving electric but in the US, but we're also building that electric transportation future. And I think it's exciting to see, and those are going to be really, those are long-term jobs in this country that we're just now sort of getting out of the gates for. I would say, maybe one of the things we're at right now, and this might be part of the reason that we have some of this, the dynamics at play in the US, is that we're in the messy middle, right? We went through the early adoption. And so, these are the places where it's people who might be interested in new technologies, more willing to consider it. And right now we're hitting much more of the average everyday person who maybe doesn't think of themselves as the person who's going to lead on early technology shifts and early technology transformations. But maybe as you look ahead, we know we can't solve every problem. We can't do everything all at once, but we do really need to move as quickly as we can to drive adoption in the US so that we can maintain our competitive automotive sector, but also because of these other problems we've identified and talked about. But what are some of the top things you might suggest that those have received federal funds could do right now? What are sort of 3 to 5 things that they could do to really move faster and smarter?
Yeah, it's a great question. One other thing that you made me think of is I think a lot of the politicization around this issue has had to do with just basic notions of freedom. And I think in transportation circles, we can really wonk out with a lot of the details and particular programs. But at the end of the day, people want choice by and large. And so I think one of the things that we were cognizant of within the administration is how to think about creating choice to reduce trips, to shift trips, to improve trips. And so the electrification revolution is not a mandate for anyone. It just provides more optionality and more choice for people to use, oh, by the way, more efficient and more effective technology versus business as usual. Look, I think in terms of
Andrew, before you answer the question, sorry, just to chime in, I think the choice part is also really important because we often forget about one key piece, which is right now, if you own a gas car, you have one choice for how you're going to power that vehicle, right? But if you plug into the grid, the benefit is the car does not care how those electrons are produced. And that means it allows us to have the cleanest, cheapest energy possible, right? And that's really exciting. And then we also can co-locate battery storage. There's all of these things that enables renewables. So we're just now at the tip of the iceberg on that piece. But I think it's important for that also for everyone to think about that choice extends beyond just the vehicle. So back to your 3 to 5.
No, and we could stay on this forever. I think there's been creative rhetoric that has flipped the narrative, where the the opposite of choice would be business as usual. Yeah, I think from an implementation perspective, when you have funds, like what that means is tricky because of where these programs live. Because CFI, for example, is contract authority, and so you really don't have cash per se. You have an award announcement, and then you have a grant agreement, and then you have to deploy the charging infrastructure. I think each of those steps is a really big deal, particularly in that architecture. So I think the more that we can think about how to get grant agreements done as efficiently and effectively as possible. I know that the Federal Highway Administration is thinking earnestly about this. If everything's a priority, nothing's a priority, but this has to be a priority to get dollars out the doors as quickly as possible. And by the way, that benefits that benefits everyone. I know we're running short on time, so I think I'll reserve the other two to four implementation opportunities. Ben, I just wanted to thank the Electrification Coalition in close, just to make sure I have enough time to say that for all the work that you do and all of the leadership that you personally have invested in our electrification future. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. We're lucky to be able to work with people like you. I think you exemplify the idea of those public servants and civil servants that are so smart and have really thought very deeply about what the future needs to look like for our country and the impacts of the transportation sector. And so I think we're all lucky to have partners. And I would say in this front, I'm lucky to have an incredible team at the EVSE who helps us support our mission every day. We do really want to get to that point of we've ended our dependency on oil, and we've really plugged in our transportation sector to drive electric. So Brant, maybe I'll pass it back to you and figure out if there's a few wrap up pieces and another Q&A that we want to do here.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Andrea. I'm glad everyone's back on so everyone can see our three presenters today. Really appreciate Corey from Bloomberg NEF, Ben from the EC, and Andrew from Epic Work Advisors. Thank you for all of your insight. The conversation was incredible, informative, insightful, and I can't thank you enough for coming on and talking to our audience today. It was really, really important. So just beyond that, we have this is the third year for Charging Infrastructure Week for the Electrification Coalition. It has been a wonderful week. We have one more social media post tomorrow. Thank you all for joining us and being a part of the Charging Infrastructure Week. It's been fantastic. And please stay tuned for the post slides for the links to our EV Funding Finder and all of our upcoming webinars. We are the Electrification Coalition. We are happy to be serving in the capacity that we do, and take care and have a great rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you.